All right. My temptation is to just listen to the opening statements. It's not like they're more than like 20 minutes, and it's sort of fair. What I want to do is I want to compare and contrast in your own mind in light of the discussion we had last afternoon, I guess, from Romans 1, Colossians 1, and 1 Corinthians chapter 1. With those things, if those form our parameters as to, once again, our theology has to determine our apologetics, not the other way around. If our apologetics is driving changes in our theology, then we've missed the boat, and we're going to be in trouble down the road. So, comparing and contrasting two of the best-known Christian apologists of our era would be very helpful. Now, I know. Let me just mention Bill Craig, who will not debate me on apologetic methodology, on Reformed theology. We've done one discussion. It wasn't a debate because there wasn't a moderator and equal time period and a thesis statement, things like that. But we did do a conversation on the Unbelievable radio broadcast in London about 2 years ago, maybe, on Molinism, which trying to explain Molinism can only be done with at least a half full bottle of ibuprofen at hand. It is the whole concept of middle knowledge and how it relates to natural knowledge and free knowledge and everything else is painful. That's the only interaction we've ever had. It's probably the only interaction we will ever have. Similarly, on Unbelievable, I likewise had a dialogue with N.T. Wright. And I was on Unbelievable a lot, many, many times. And the nice part was most of the time I was on Unbelievable, I was in studio in London. That was always enjoyable. I will miss that. Of course, the program doesn't exist anymore, but similar programs still do. And I will miss London. London was an amazing place to get to. I told my wife, she was there a few weeks ago. I told her, I said, if you want to have London to yourself, go running just before sunrise. Don't go running in the dark, but once it starts lighting, when the sun starts coming up, it isn't up yet, that's when you will have the city to yourself. And I got to stay at the Royal Horse Guards Hotel. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that, but it was at one point during World War II, that was the headquarters of British intelligence. And they've converted into a hotel, very, very fancy, very, very neat. And it's right there on the Thames, right across from the Eye, the big, huge Ferris wheel, right across from the Eye, Big Ben's right over here. 2 bridges, including, the one you run across to Big Ben. And then over here is the road that goes up to Trafalgar Square. There's an actually decent Mexican restaurant in Trafalgar Square. I don't know how many times I've eaten there, but I had a fascinating conversation with Adnan Rashid, this big, huge Pakistani guy, Muslim guy, at that Mexican restaurant at Trafalgar Square. I'm sure MI6 was watching us. And I'm sure there's a picture somewhere of me hugging this 6'4" tall Pakistani guy who still to this day just does not understand how there's a Christian who debates him strongly, but clearly loves him anyways. I'm a walking contradiction to everything he thought Christianity was, which is good. But last time I saw him, actually, we debated at G3. I don't know if any of you saw that, but when I did the debate with a Muslim at G3 a few years ago. It was Adnan Rashid. Anyway, how did I get to that? Oh, you can go running out there, run past the eye, over the bridges, nobody there. 2 hours later, you will not be able to walk swiftly across those things. Just too many people, just massively crowded. I miss it, but I also mourn the fact that I don't know that I would have the freedom to say the things I used to say in debates in the United Kingdom, that the things I would say, I don't know that they'd be allowed now. They're arresting people for doing that stuff. I think they'd make me persona non grata and say, get out of here. Just checking here, my phone keeps going bing, bing, bing. And so it's, when you're away from home, it's always good to see what's going on. Anyway, all right, so what I have here are two debates. They were semi-contemporaneous. They're in the 80s. The one with William Lane Craig comes after the one with Craig Bahnsen. And so what I'm going to try to do, I only have audio here, so if I had video, it'd be easier for me to find stuff. But okay, why didn't that start?
Values, they make the exhibit, but that entails question where the evidence.
This is Craig and
Okay, so this is William Lane Craig, a classical apologist, and what I was going to say, sorry, I went off on a tangent again. I realize that Bill Craig has some interesting theological aberrations. He is a self-professed neo-Apollinarian. So if you know what Apollinarianism is, if you understand the ancient Christian heresies, Christological heresies, you've heard of, I use my hands to illustrate this. Maybe you'll find it to be useful. The Orthodox position as defined, I believe, necessarily by Scripture, but then stated by the Council of Chalcedon, and we could have a whole discussion, which we would in church history, but we'll do that some other time, about the relationship of the authority of Scripture and the authority of canons and creeds. But the Orthodox position is that Christ has two natures, God and man, fully God, fully man, and that they are related to one another hypostatically. So it's called the hypostatic union. Nestorianism may not believe this, but Nestorianism separates the two so that the one who is born of Mary, or the one who is conceived in Mary, Nestorius rejected the term Theotokos, or Theotokos if you use modern Greek pronunciation, the God-bearer, or as it comes across in English, Mother of God. That term was initially a Christological term. It had nothing to do with Mary. Now it has everything to do with Mary within Roman Catholicism. But Nestorianism separates that hypostatic union to where the one who is conceived is not the God-man at the point of conception. Eutychianism mixes the two natures. So you don't have fully God or fully man, you have a mixture of the two. That's Eutychianism. Apollinarianism replaces the mind or spirit of the human with the Logos. So that the human Jesus is not fully human. He doesn't have a human mind or spirit. That's replaced by the Logos. Okay? That's Apollinarianism. Bill Craig's an Apollinarian by his own profession. He does not believe in the hypostatic union. He also uses some of the worst illustrations of the doctrine of the Trinity that I've ever heard of, including illustrating it by the mythical beast called Kerberos, which is a three-headed dog. in Greek mythology. He's actually used that to try to describe the doctrine of the Trinity. I don't believe he believes in, he does not believe in original sin. He really doesn't. He refused to defend it in debating Shabir Ali. And so, yeah, there's some real problems. And see, I know certain people, David Bentley Hart, who I've never had a relationship, but David Bentley Hart, N.T. Wright, William Lane Craig, they all view themselves as being so far above their contemporaries that they don't feel themselves bound by any kind of creedal orthodoxy. There are people like that pretty much think they're smarter than anybody who's come before them, is how that works. So there are some issues there. None of that comes up in Craig's opening, but what does come up is the fact that, from my opinion, Bill Craig minimizes the target for his opponent to attack to the point of reducing Christianity to such bare minimums that it no longer really represents Christianity. That's one of my main criticisms at that point with him. When we go to Craig Bahnsen, like I said, Bahnsen did his PhD in, I think at USC, on self-deception. How does mankind deceive himself? Which is an interesting, epistemology field, philosophy field, things like that. He was a Presbyterian, OPC, obviously a student of Cornelius Van Til, and as I said, just a brilliant thinker that left us far too soon. So with that, let's listen to Bill Craig's opening statement. You will have to listen carefully because, again, I don't know what the problem was in the 1980s, but we couldn't record anything clearly, I guess. We managed to do the music all right. I mean, okay, 80s music and 70s music. Okay, there you go. You can't argue with the fact that the 70s were incredible. Of course, I go back to the 30s and 40s, and then you can understand why some of those recordings don't sound so good. So this is in front of over 5,000 people. I think they had people spread all over the campus there at Willow Creek. It was massively attended, and he's debating a guy by the name of Frank Zindler. Now, what you'll discover is the vast majority of atheists who do debates are not experts in the field. They are experts in some other field, but they hate God. So, the antifreeze debate, I'm debating a guy who designed the Lucan. Okay, he wins. Any type of design of mechanical stuff, he wins. But that's not what we're debating. So there's the issue. So let's listen to what William Lane Craig had to say. Try to follow his argument in light of the stuff we've already talked about.
Well, welcome to both sides, Frank Zindler and Bill Craig. Glad you could both be here tonight.
Okay.
And as we get started, I
Never mind.
them down and encourage them to ramp up.
Good evening. In tonight's debate, we've been asked to assess the question where the evidence points to atheism or to Christianity. Now, before we can answer that question, we need to have some idea of what we're talking about. So let me begin by defining some terms. First, by Christianity, I'm in the view that God exists and has revealed himself decisively in Jesus Christ. We're not being called upon to debate fine points of doctrine, which Christians themselves differ on, like, is the Bible inerrant? Or did God use evolution to create living things? These are of secondary importance in comparison with the fundamental truth that God exists and has decisively revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ. Secondly, by atheism, I mean the view that God does not exist. On the atheist view, there is no such being or person as God. Now, the question before us tonight is, when you weigh the evidence for atheism against the evidence for Christianity, which way, on balance, does the evidence point? In support of a Christian answer to that question, I'm going to defend two basic contentions in tonight's debate. Number one, there's no good evidence that atheism is true. And number two, there is good evidence that Christianity is true. Let's look then at my first basic contention. There's no good evidence that atheism is true. The claim that God does not exist is just as much a claim to know something as is the claim that God does exist. Therefore, if Mr. Zindler is to maintain that the evidence points toward atheism, he's got to do more than just say there's no good evidence for God's existence. He must present evidence against God's existence. He's therefore simply mistaken when he says in the Tribune that atheism makes no claims, and so it has nothing to defend. Atheist philosophers have tried for centuries to disprove the existence of God, but no one's been able to come up with a convincing argument. So rather than attack straw men at this point, I'll just wait to hear Mr. Zindler's response to the following question. What is the evidence that atheism is true? Let's go on then to my second basic contention. There is good evidence that Christianity is true. And here I'd like to present 5 lines of evidence which render the Christian faith highly probable in contrast to atheism. Number 1, the evidence points to a creator of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why anything at all exists instead of just nothing? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is eternal, and that's all. But surely this is unreasonable. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians know that an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. That shows that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, perhaps the greatest mathematician of this century, states, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't just go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. The astrophysical evidence indicates that the universe began to exist in a great explosion called the Big Bang about 15 billion years ago. Physical space and time were created in that event, as well as all the matter and energy in the universe. Therefore, as the Cambridge astronomer Fred Hoyle points out, the Big Bang theory requires the creation of the universe from nothing. This is because as you go back in time, you reach a point at which, in Hoyle's words, the universe was shrunk down to nothing at all. Thus, what the Big Bang model requires is that the universe began to exist and was created out of nothing. Now, this tends to be very awkward for the atheist. Quentin Smith, an atheist philosopher, writes, the response of atheists to this development has been comparatively weak, indeed almost invisible. An uncomfortable silence seems to be the rule when the issue arises among non-believers. The reason for the embarrassment of non-theists is not hard to find. Anthony Kenny of Oxford University suggests it in this statement. A proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But that's a pretty hard pill to swallow. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a cause. which brought the universe into being. From the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. Isn't it incredible that the Big Bang Theory thus points to exactly what the Christian has always believed, that in the beginning, God created the universe? Now, I put it to you, which is more plausible? That the Christian is right, or that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing? I at least don't have any trouble assessing these probabilities. Number two, the evidence points to an intelligent designer of the cosmos. During the last 25 years, scientists have discovered that the existence of intelligent life depends upon an incredibly delicate and complex balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. We now know that life-prohibiting universes are vastly more probable than our life-permitting universe. How much more probable? Well, before I give you an estimation, let me share with you some numbers just to give you a feel for the odds. The number of seconds in the history of the universe is around 10 to the 18th power. That is 10 followed by 18 zeros. The number of subatomic particles in the entire universe is said to be about 10 to the 80th power. Now, with those numbers in mind, consider the following. Donald Page, one of America's eminent cosmologists, has calculated the odds of our universe existing as 1 out of 10 billion to the 124th power. A number which is so inconceivable that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. Robert Jastrow, the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, has called this the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science. Once again, the view that Christians have always held, that there is an intelligent designer of the universe, seems much more plausible than the atheistic interpretation of chance. Number three, the evidence points to God as the source of objective moral values. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Many theists and atheists alike concur on this point. For example, the late J.L. Mackie of Oxford University, one of the most influential atheists of our time, admitted, if there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God. But in order to avoid God's existence, Mackie therefore denied that objective moral values exist. He wrote, "It is easy to explain this moral sense as a natural product of biological and social evolution." Professor Michael Roos, a philosopher of science at the University of Guelph, agrees. He writes, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist of the last century who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right, but we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can't we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? Like Mackey and Ruth, I don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens is objective. And here Mr. Zindler would agree with me. After all, if there's no God, then what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the atheist view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous and so has become taboo, but that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, if you can escape the social consequences, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the fact is that objective moral values do exist, and we all know it. There is no more reason to deny the objective existence of moral values than to deny the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, brutality, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, generosity, and self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. Number 4, the evidence points to God's decisively revealing himself in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. Although Mr. Zindler takes the peculiar position that Jesus never existed, New Testament critics have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus of Nazareth came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. That's why the Jewish leadership instigated his crucifixion for the charge of blasphemy. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come. And as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracles and exorcism. But certainly the supreme vindication of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for God's self-revelation in Jesus. There are 3 main historical facts that support the resurrection of Jesus: his empty tomb, Jesus' appearances alive after his death, and the very origin of the Christian faith. Let's look briefly at each one of these. First, the evidence indicates that Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on Sunday morning. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian scholar who has specialized in the study of the resurrection, by far, most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. And he lists 28 prominent scholars in support. I can think of at least 16 more that he neglected to mention. According to New Testament critic D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Second, the evidence indicates that on separate occasions, different individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the late Norman Perrin of the University of Chicago, the more we investigate the traditions with regard to the appearances, the firmer the rock begins to appear upon which they are based. These appearances were bodily and physical, and were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. Third, the very origin of the Christian faith implies the reality of the resurrection. We all know that Christianity sprang into being in the middle of the 1st century. Where did it come from? Why did it arise? Well, all scholars agree that it came into being because the disciples believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead, and they proclaimed this message everywhere that they went. But where in the world did they come up with that belief? If you deny that Jesus really did rise from the dead, then you've got to explain the disciples' belief in terms of either Christian influences or Jewish influences. Now, obviously, it couldn't have come from Christian influences for the simple reason that there wasn't any Christianity yet. But neither can it be explained from the side of Jewish influences, because the Jewish concept of resurrection was radically different from Jesus' resurrection. As the renowned New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremias puts it, nowhere does one find in the literature of ancient Judaism anything comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. The most plausible explanation of the origin of the disciples' belief, therefore, is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Attempts to explain away these three great facts, like the disciples stole a body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The fact is that there just is no plausible naturalistic explanation of these facts. Therefore, it seems to me the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. And finally, number 6, God can be immediately known and experienced. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by experiencing him. This was the way in which people in the Bible knew God, as Professor John Hick explains. God was known to them as a dynamic will, interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm and life-giving sunshine. They did not think of God as an inferred entity, but as an experienced reality. To them, God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experiential reality which gave significance to their lives. Now, if this is so, then there's the danger that arguments for God could actually distract our attention from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. In conclusion, then, we've yet to see any evidence that atheism is true, and we have seen 5 lines of evidence which suggest that Christianity is true. If Mr. Zindler wants us to believe atheism instead, then he's got to first tear down all of the evidence for Christianity which I've presented, and then in its place erect a case of his own which is more convincing for the truth of atheism. Unless and until he does that, then I think it's pretty clear which way the evidence points.
Okay, pretty clear. The very formation of the thesis of the debate is assuming the existence of evidence. It somewhat assumes the standards by which evidence is going to be judged. It certainly assumes that everybody in the audience is qualified to judge evidence. It assumes that we all share together a foundation to be able to identify evidence, to evaluate it. So laws of logic, everything like that is not even addressed. And look, Zindler's case, I can just tell you, is not exactly compelling. Generally, they're not good speakers. They're not well organized. Craig is always well organized in any debate he does on any topic.
How do you do in his time right there?
I wasn't looking at it, but he's good with time. He's always good with time. And I can tell you that he's going to get up in the next one, and he's going to repeat he always makes sure to say, let's review, and he repeats the points that he's made, and to the detriment of actually interacting with the other side, just wants to make sure that what he's doing, and this makes sense, to make sure that the audience has heard his points, especially when the other guy's scattered. That makes it sound like you know what you're doing and the other guy doesn't. I mean, that's not necessarily a sound conclusion to come to, but it's functionally it's a good thing to do. So he's very experienced. I don't know how many debates he's done. I don't think he's done quite as many as I have, but he's certainly done a lot of them, and pretty much in the same general area, philosophical atheism, stuff like that. He's engaged. Shabir Ali, I can't remember if he's engaged like with subjects of the deity of Christ or Mormonism or something like that. It's almost always in a philosophical atheistic context with a little bit of Islam thrown in for the fun of it. It's not like I've seen a list of his debates. When I did, it was around 65 or something like that. I did see a debate list years and years ago. With that, let me see if I can find Greg's. There was no music in the original, just so you know.
Warm welcome to Dr. Gordon being philosophically defensive Philosophical Society, as well as an advisory board member of the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. Dr. Bahnsen has published numerous articles on apologetics, ethics, and Christian theology, as well as 4 scholarly books. Dr. Bahnsen is currently the pastor of Covenant Community Church, located in Placentia, California. He resides in the Orange County area with his wife, Kathy, and his 4 children. Debating Dr. Bahnsen this evening will be Dr. Gordon Stein. Dr. Gordon Stein received a PhD from Ohio State University. He has established himself as one of America's foremost scholars of atheism. He is currently the president of the American Rationalist Federation, president of the Free Thought Association, member of the board of directors of the North American Committee for Humanism, vice president Pacific of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and vice president of Atheists United. Dr. Stein has authored 5 leading books, 2 pamphlets, one of which, by the way, is entitled How to Argue with a Theist and Win, as well as several scholarly articles. He is also the editor of the American Rationalist Journal and the associate editor of Free Inquiry magazine. Having introduced both speakers to you, we will now begin this evening's debate. The resolution before us is in the form of an interrogative, a question. Does God exist? Dr. Bahnsen, I'll now ask for your 15-minute opening statement, please.
Thank you, David. I want to begin this evening with 3 opening and introductory remarks about the nature of the debate itself. First of all, it's necessary at the outset of our debate to define our terms and qualification. In particular here, I should make it clear what I mean when I use the term God. I want to specify that I'm arguing particularly in favor of Christian theism and for it as a unit or system of thought, and not for anything like theism in general. And there are reasons for that. 3. The various conceptions of deity found in the world of religion are, in most cases, logically incompatible, leaving no unambiguous sense to general theism, whatever that might be. Secondly, I have not found the non-Christian religions to be philosophically defensible, each of them being internally incoherent or undermining human reason and experience. And thirdly, since I am a great and God Christian, I cannot from the heart actively send those religious faiths with which I disagree. My commitment is to the triune God and Christian worldview based on God's revelation in the Old and New Testament. Well, first, I'm defending Christian theism. Secondly, I want to observe, and we should indicate what it is not at issue in the debate on the basis of which we hope to consider the debate. Let me be clear that we are debating about philosophical systems, not the people who adhere to or profess them. Our concerns with the objective merits of the case which can be made for intuition or Christian theism, not related to subjective or personal matters. And again, I have 3 reasons for illustrations of this. The personalities of those individuals who adhere to different systems of thought are not really relevant
to the truth or falsity of the claims made by those systems. Atheists and Christians can equally be found emotional, unlearned, intolerant, or rude in their approaches. Secondly, subjective claims made about the experience of inner satisfaction or peace, claims that are made only by both Christians and atheists in the literature, and promotional claims made about the superiority of Christianity or atheism, for instance, from atheist worship and greater mental health through the independence of the atheist outlook. These sorts of things are always subject to conflicting interpretations and explanations, being, I think, more autobiographical rather than telling us anything for sure about the truth of the system under consideration. Thirdly, the issue is not whether atheists or professing Christians have ever done anything undesirable or morally unacceptable. One needs to think respectively of the atheist involvement in the reign of terror in the French Revolution and the professing Christian involvement in the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the question is not whether adherence to these systems does stop with lives, but whether atheism or Christian theism as philosophical systems are objectively true. And so I'll be saying Christian theism, and I'll be defending it as a philosophical system. In my last introductory remarks, it's simply to the effect that I want to concede to my opponent all issues pertaining to the control of ovarian maturation in Japanese soil. We're lucky to this doctrine was the case in 1974 in Ohio State. Dr. Stein is a man of intelligence, and that's not in question in this debate. I would not pretend to put my own in discussion with him of the empirical details which now have been made of specialized sample science. However, our subject tonight is really much different, calling for intelligent reflection upon issues that are philosophical and theological in character. For some reason, Dr. Stein has, over the last decade, left his field of expertise and given his life to a campaign for atheism. Whatever his perception of the reason for that, I do not believe that it's because of any genuinely cogent philosophical case which might be made for atheism and worldviews. And it's a good subject which I now turn for tonight's debate. My opening case for the existence of God will cover three areas of thought. They are the nature of ethics, the presuppositional conflict of worldviews, and finally the transcendental argument for God's existence. First of all, the nature of ethics. How should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? What Dr. Stein has written indicates that he, like many atheists, does not reflect adequately on this question. He writes, and I quote, "The question of the existence of God is a factual question. It should be answered in the same way as any other factual question." End of quote. The assumption that all existence claims are questions about matters of fact. The assumption that these are all answered in the very same way is not merely oversimplified and misleading, but it's simply mistaken. The existence, factuality, or reality of different kinds of things is not established or disconfirmed in the same way in every case. We might ask if there are a box of crackers in the pantry, and we know how we would go about answering that question. But that is a far cry from the way we go about answering a question of determining the reality of, say, barometric pressure, quasars, gravitational attraction, elasticity, radioactivity, natural laws, names, grammar, numbers, the university itself, that you're now at, past events, categories, future contingencies, laws of thought, political obligations, individual identity over time, causation, memory, dreams, or even love or beauty. In such cases, one does not do anything like walking to the pantry and looking inside for the crackers. There are thousands of existence of actual questions, but they are not as answered in the same way in each case. Just think of the differences in argumentation and types of evidence used by biologists, grammarians, physicists, mathematicians, lawyers, logicians, mechanics, commercials, and artists. It could be obvious the type of evidence which one looks for in existence of actual claims will be determined by the field of discussion, and especially by the metaphysical nature of the entity mentioned in the claim under question. Dr. Stein's remarks that the existence of God is answered, the question of the existence of God is answered in the same way that as any other factual question, mistakenly reduces the theistic question to the same level as a box of crackers in the pantry, which we will perhaps call the crackers in the pantry fallacy. Secondly, that I'd like to talk about the presupposition and conflict of worldviews. Dr. Stein has written about the nature of evidence in the theistic debate, and what he has said points to a second philosophical error of significant proportion. In passing, we would note how unclear he is, by the way, in speaking of the evidence which must be used, describing it variously as logic, fact, or reason. Each of these terms is susceptible to a whole host of different senses, not only in philosophy, but especially in ordinary usage, depending on who's using the term. I take it he wishes to judge hypotheses in the common sense by logical coherence and empirical observation. The problem arises when Dr. Stein elsewhere insists that every claim which someone makes must be treated as a hypothesis which must be tested on such evidence before accepting it. There is nothing, he says, when facts are taking the process of the reasoning. This, I think, is oversimplified thinking, and it's getting misleading, what we might call the pretended neutrality fallacy. One can see this by considering the following quotation from Dr. Stein, where I quote, "Use of logic for a reason is the only valid way to examine the truth of falsity of the statement which claims to be factual." That's the end of the quote. One must eventually ask Dr. Stein how he proved this statement itself. That is, how does he prove that logic for reason is the only way to prove factual statements? He's now on the point of a real epistemological dilemma. If he says that the statement is proven by logical reason, then he's engaging in circular reason, and then he's begging the question, which is constant from this. But he says that the statement is proven in some other fashion, then he refutes the statement itself. That logical reason is the only way to prove things. And my point is not to Dr. Stein's commitment to logical reason, but to observe that it actually has the nature of a pre-commitment or a presupposition. It is not something he has proven by empirical experiential logic, but it is rather that by which he proceeds to prove everything else. He is not presuppositionally useful in his approach to factual basis of his theory. He does not avoid making crucial questions, rather than proving them in what we might call the garden variety, ordinary way. Now, this tendency to make crucial questions is openly exposed by Dr. Stein when he becomes the existence of God, because he demands that the theist present him with evidence for the existence of God. Now, theists like myself would gladly and readily use them. Here is the evidence of the created order itself, testifying to the wisdom, power, plan, and glory of God. One could not miss the testimony of the foolishness and the persuasion of the seed, the amazing intricacies of the human mind. There's the evidence of fish raising, God's deliverance of his people, the miracles, the Passover night, the Red Sea, the visions of Isaiah, the Shekinah glory in the temple, the virgin birth of Jesus, the mighty miracle, the resurrection of the dead. There's the evidence of special revelation, the wonder of the Bible as God's word, as surpassing its coherence over time, and its historical accuracy and its life-revealing power. In short, there is no shortage of empirical indicators or evidences of God's existence, from the 1,000 stars of the heavens to the 500 witnesses of Christ's resurrection. But Dr. Stein precludes the very possibility of any of this empirical evidence counting as proof of God's existence. He writes, and I quote, "Supernatural explanations are not allowed in science. The theist was hard put to document his claims to the existence of the supernatural, yet he is, and in fact, forbidden from invoking the supernatural as a part of his explanation. Of course, this is entirely fair, as it would be making the question to use what has to be proved as a part of the explanation." In advance, Dr. Stein is committed to disallowing any theistic interpretation of nature, history, or experience. What he seems to overlook is that this is just as much taking the question on his own part as it is on the part of the theist who appeals to such evidence. He is not at all proven by empirical observation and logic his pre-commitment to naturalism. He has assumed it in advance, accepting and rejecting all further factual claims in terms of that controlling and unproven assumptions. Now, the theist does the very same thing, don't get me wrong. When certain empirical evidences are put forth as allegedly disproving the existence of God, the theist regiments his commitments in terms of his presuppositions as well. If just as the naturalist would insist that Christ could not have risen from the dead, or that there is a natural explanation that can be found how he did rise from the dead, so the supernaturalist insists that the alleged discrepancies in the Bible have an explanation from yet to be found for that, and that the evil of this world has a sufficient reason behind it, known at least to God. They both have their governing presuppositions by which the facts of experience are interpreted, even as all philosophical systems, all worldviews do. At the most fundamental level of everyone's thinking and belief, there are primary convictions about reality, man, the world, knowledge, truth, behavior, and such things. Convictions about which all other experience is organized, interpreted, and applied. Dr. Stein has such presuppositions, and so do I, so do all of you. And it is these presuppositions which determine what we accept by ordinary reasoning evidence, for they are assumed in all of our reasoning, even about reasoning itself. And so I come thirdly then to the transcendental proof of God's existence. How then should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? That was my opening question. We've seen two of Dr. Stein's errors regarding it: the crackers in the pantry fallacy and the pretended neutrality fallacy. In the process of discussing them, we've observed that belief in the existence of God is not centered in any ordinary way like other factual claims. And the reason for that is metaphysically because of the non-natural character of God, and epistemologically because of the presuppositional character of commitment for or against his existence. Arguments over conflicting presuppositions between worldviews, therefore, must be resolved somewhat differently, and yet still rationally, than conflicts over factual existence claims within any worldview or system of thought. When we go to look at the different worldviews that atheists and theists have, I suggest that we can prove the existence of God from the impossibility of the contrary. The transcendental proof for God's existence is that without him, it is impossible to prove anything. The atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the three conditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. The atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the ability for the mind to understand the world, and moral absolutes. And in that sense, the atheist worldview cannot account for our debate tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Bahnsen, for opening statement. We'll have to go Dr. Stein. 15 minutes opening statement, please.
Okay, now everyone has admitted over the decades since that 15 minutes is a short period of time. Well, it's funny when you're in a debate. 15 minutes when you're speaking is a ridiculously short amount of time. When the other guy's talking, it seems like forever. So that's just how debates work. But obviously, if I want to critique Greg's presentation, I would say he could have cut back some of the lists he gave by, a third or a half, and had more time to expand upon the nature of the transcendental argument for the existence of God, which is basically an argument in the form of the impossibility of the contrary. That is basically what the presuppositionalist does, is provide an internal critique of the position that you're arguing against, whether it's a theistic system or a non-theistic system. Here he's debating a non-theistic system, and therefore the argument is going to be that non-theistic system cannot provide you with a coherent foundation for believing in the laws of logic, rationality, and therefore is self-refuting in and of itself. It's a little trickier, in my opinion, when you start trying to make application of the transcendental argument in theistic systems. Dr. Oliphant seeks to do so in his book on covenantal apologetics with Islam. And I find it Interesting argument. I certainly agree that providing an internal critique is a very useful thing, but Islam has Islamic theology has a transcendent, eternal God who's the origin and creator of all things. And so it would seem that the argument is more in regards to the inconsistency, since Islam's divine revelation claims to be a continuation of what was already given to Moses and Jesus. It is the fact that the author of the Quran didn't know almost anything about that revelation that is, I think, the strongest criticism of that position. Not necessarily, and I'm not sure that's necessarily fits into a transcendental argument. Now, so Stein gets up. There must be almost no pictures of Stein in existence, because you can see up there in the corner, that's about the only one I've ever seen. Now, it is interesting. Bahnsen and Stein had written correspondence after this debate that was never made public. I have all of it. And so there was a lot of fleshing out of, some people do this. I do not sit around reviewing my old debates and going, oh, I should have said this, oh, I should have said that. What I said. Most people who've never been in the situation of having a very limited amount of time and having to sit there and listen to the other side and prioritize the points the other side has made and then respond to that, but having a very limited response time to do that. And of course, in most debates, your rebuttal time is normally half of your presentation time. So there's just so much you can't get to. You can't even get there. But I don't find it overly useful to, go back over that and go, well, I should have done this, should have done that. It's not that I don't think I could learn something, but that's how it is. So, we could look at Greg's opening presentation, go, it would have been nice to have more time to flesh out that thing. What happened was, in the cross-examination, as in all debates, that's when you really start seeing who has the solid understanding, who has the solid presentation. Bob? So this is let me see if this actually.
Dr. Stein, did you hear Dr. Bahnsen?
Okay, so what somebody did here is they took those two pictures and they put a little mouth on it, okay? And they also put in a couple extraneous comments at a few points. So ignore all of that, but this helps to, I don't have to sit there and play through stuff. And it's only 2 minutes and 19 seconds long. But so this is someone's opinion of what the most important stuff in the cross-ex was.
Dr. Stein, did you hear Dr. Bahnsen use the following argument? The Bible says that God exists, and the Bible is the inspired word of God, therefore what it says must be true, therefore God exists. You did not use that and just assume that that was so because you were quoting from the Bible as if it came in what I assumed. They asked me if I used that argument. No, you did not use the argument, but you used the results of the argument. Dr. Stein, you mentioned 11 basic proofs for the existence of God. Did you mention the transcendental proof for the existence of God? No, I didn't mention it by name. I think it is not a proof. I would not call it a proof. As I understand it, from what you said. On that point, that's pretty. Didn't do that particular one. Are all factual questions answered in the very same way? No, they are not. They're answered by the use of certain methods, though, that are the same. Reason, logic, and presenting evidence. I heard you mention logical binds and logical self-contradictions in your speech. You did say that? I said it. I used that phrase, yes. You believe there are laws of logic, then? Absolutely. Are they universal? They're agreed upon by human beings. They aren't laws that exist out in nature. Are they simply conventions, then? They're conventions, but they're conventions that are self-verifying. Are they sociological laws or laws of thought? They are laws of thought which are interpreted by men and promulgated by men. Are they material in nature? How can the law be material? That's the question I'm going to ask you. I would say no. Dr. Bahnsen, would you call God material or immaterial? Immaterial. What is something that's immaterial? Something not extended as faith. Can you give me an example of anything other than God that's immaterial? Laws of logic.
Yeah. Stein struggled to recover from that one because everybody broke up. The whole audience was applauding because it was like, didn't you see that coming? Given the questions he had asked you. He really struggled. It was very, very obvious that Stein was completely unfamiliar with any kind of presuppositional approach. And so his whole opening argument was against standard evidence-based classical apologetics and things like that. And he didn't really touch on Bahnsen's stuff. And so it didn't start until the cross-X, and he fell into some pretty major traps at that particular point in time. But it is very clear that when you contrast these two presentations, one is appealing to the audience to judge particular evidences, and the other is saying, in essence, you, the audience, are judged by the reality that if you cannot provide some other foundation for the existence of the laws of logic and therefore the reasoning that we're supposed to be doing, then you have to admit that the Christian God's the origin of these things. And look, that's arguments from the impossibility contrary, things like that. That's not what people are normally accustomed to hearing, because we live in a culture where the assumption is that we do possess, as individuals, the power and ability to judge in perfection and at least sufficiently to be the central determining factor in all things. So let me I should have done this. Well, you all would have been watching me do this instead of listening to that. I put together a presentation, and you would think that I would have named it something that would allow me to find it very easily. It was in my presentation in my debate with Barker which would be before Mac for me. And it's funny when you're trying to read these teeny tiny little things that they are very difficult to find. But I have a graphic. I've probably saved as all right, 2013. That's, I'll end up stopping right before I actually would run into it. Atheism debate, where is it? And of course, once you start going faster, you overlook it. If anybody sees an atheism debate go by, of course, you all maybe, it's pretty small for you to see, I would imagine. Man, I've made a lot of presentations over the years. I hope someone will keep these things. Probably won't. It'll probably, Yeah. So this is the presentation I used with Dan Barker. And I wonder if, yeah, I did. Okay. All right, let me show you this first, then I'll show you something else. Here's this is what I was trying to describe earlier. This is the situation that secularism presents to us. Man is placed in the center, and we therefore are to interact with and come to understand and place in its proper position in the universe everything else. So morality, science, love, others, history, law, government, and God himself becomes an object of knowledge that we are to somehow in and of ourselves have the ability to define, et cetera, et cetera. And I say to you, man was never created to be able to do this. Man is insufficient to do this. None of us have the amount of information that is necessary to do any of that. What the Christian proposes is this, that the triune God who made morality, science, love, history, others, law, me, and government has to be in the center. And therefore, if I'm going to have true knowledge of all these other things, it's going to be mediated through my relationship with the triune God, who then is the creator of all these things and can tell me how these things are to relate to one another through his word and by his spirit. So this is, I think, one of the fundamental differences that we need to understand, and to also to recognize that most of our people don't have this view. They're not going to get it from the educational system. In fact, they're going to come in from the educational system with the exact opposite of this view in mind. And that means we have to, in some fashion, through our preaching and teaching, through the consistency of our application of these things, we have to challenge the aberrant view and encourage them to embrace what's a truly biblical view. It's the only way they're going to be able to really develop a functioning Christian worldview. But one of the things I did, and since I happen to have this, this will be sort of cool. Yeah, I had somebody do this. Was early on. What, I forget when I made this, but this was early on in graphic stuff. And so I had a friend put his face on a judge. It's a little bit small, isn't it? And it's not, that's the problem with the early Photoshop stuff. But I was talking about how he puts himself in the position of judging, and how he actually described us as, at one point, as cosmic broccoli. You know, how can cosmic broccoli make judgment on these kinds of things? But I did present evidence. Here's my discussion. I said, let's look at solid, strong evidence of the existence of the triune God, not as a neutral fact from which I suggest we reason to God, but as a fact of reality that can only make sense in light of God's existence, and as a fact that will illustrate the materialists' unwillingness to allow for conclusions that challenge their worldview. See how I'm presenting that? I'm presenting it completely different than you would in a classical apologetic situation. So again, Van Til was very clear. All evidence is God's evidence. And so we can utilize all evidence, because if it exists in God's world, then it's God's evidence. And so I said, let's look at solid, strong evidence of the existence of the triune God, not as a neutral fact. So I'm not saying this is a neutral fact. We're stepping onto a neutral ground together, and we're going to reason together. No, that's not what I'm doing. Not as a neutral fact from which I suggest we reason to God, but as a fact of reality that can only make sense in light of God's existence. Yes, sir.
In William Lane Craig's opening statement that we listened to, that was not his approach for most of it. But would you say you kind of strayed into that during the moral argument, at least? It kind of seemed
that's
adjacent to it.
Both the moral argument and then his last argument. What was his last argument? His last argument was maybe the best argument for the existence of God is your own experience. Now, I struggle with that because there's an element of truth. That, if you're truthfully speaking about something that reflects God's world, well, then that is evidence for God, whether you're presenting it consistently or not. That doesn't really matter. But that particular point almost sounds sort of like a end of presentation altar call, and what it makes me do is go, okay, what do you then, in light of that, say to the Muslim that says he's experienced Allah? They wouldn't use that terminology, though. Okay, to the Mormon who says he's at, the Mormon testimony or something like that. How do you respond to something like that? So that's why I wouldn't have done that type of thing. But yeah, I have seen all sorts of people who are presuppositionally and by apologetic commitment opposed to presuppositional apologetics use presuppositional apologetics because they can't avoid it. They can't escape it. I've heard Frank Turek use presuppositional argumentation, even though he fundamentally disagrees with its overall application and its foundation. Because honestly, foundationally, you have to take very seriously the fact that God's revelation has gotten through. It is known. It is understood through what has been made. And you really have to believe in the deadness of man and sin. You have to have a reformed anthropology to approach man in that case. If you don't, you're going to be being inconsistent. So here's what I said about presuppositions and evidence. And then I really like this. I stole this. Now, is that working up there? No, let me see if. Oh, drat. Hold on a second. I guess it. All right. This is a. That is supposed to be. Hold on a second. Huh. This is so old. That's a video. And it's supposed to be in motion. And evidently it's so old now that maybe it can't play this or it converted to something else or something. I don't know. There are a number of videos on YouTube now that describe this function. This is, what's the name of it? ATP polymerase, I think. This is a structure that is functioning in all of your cells right now. Billions of them in each and every one of. Yes, sir?
Oh, I was gonna ask just real quick, like, if I was to ask like Frank Turek or somebody else, like, what's the objection to presuppositional apologetics? Like, why isn't it something, because you're a believer, you believe in the word of God, like, why would you not want to go there?
For them, you're functionally they don't want to ask the person to assume that there is such a thing as a meaningful revelation from God. So they're trying to minimize the target from the other side. Bahnsen, you'll notice, spoke of inerrancy in his presentation. He didn't dodge any of that. He didn't duck any of that. That was he doesn't have any problem doing that. But they really don't want to get into that kind of stuff because I don't think Bill Craig believes in inerrancy. He teaches at Biola where you're supposed to, but I don't think he actually believes it in any meaningful fashion. So they find it incoherent at that point. And if you're Reformed, you can trust the Holy Spirit of God to draw the elect and to open their hearts and minds. If you're not, you don't want to close things down prematurely. So anyway, this, it'd be a whole lot easier if you could see the top thing is going to be rotating. Hold on a second. I'm online, so hold on a second. Let's see if we can fix this here. We don't have to have Greg smugly smiling at us anymore. Making energy. Like I said, there's so many of them. That was one of the earlier ones. I'm probably looking at the wrong phrase.
Would it be like structure and function, maybe?
That looks. Yeah, okay. All right, yeah, here it is right there. ATP synthase, not polymerase, synthase. Okay, there you go. Oh, stop. There you go. All right. In the walls of the mitochondria in your cells, there are millions of these structures. And it's spinning because the chemical pressure of the number of ions in this part of it is higher than this part of it. So it uses that chemical pressure to turn this mechanism. And what this mechanism does, your body runs on what's called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. I was department fellow in anatomy and physiology. I love this stuff. And it's what makes your muscles contract and your heart beat and your brain function. It is the fuel of your body. And how you produce ATP, electron chain transport, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, hey Bob, all these are when I had to take my senior boards, I had written all this stuff out on the board, on this whiteboard in this conference room. And instead of having me erase it, they said, you know what? Let's leave it up there. We'll ask you more in-depth questions now that it's up there. But I passed. So, and it's incredibly designed stuff. I mean, how you can look at this stuff and go, accident, random, yeah, it's impossible. This in particular, because it can turn either direction. And what it does is it uses that mechanical energy of a higher ion concentration here and a lower ion concentration here, pulling material down through the mechanism to create energy of, like, well, every car you see going by out here, that's how they're running. You're creating energy through the explosions and the cylinders, and that, turns everything, the gears and all the rest of them. What this does is adenosine triphosphate cuts off one phosphate group and it becomes adenosine diphosphate. The energy produced by cutting that off is what you run on. You run on that. That's how your muscles contract. That's how it is the universal energy of the body. And not just humans. This is plants, animals, it happens in the fish and the bacteria and everything else. And so the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So now you go through all this process to produce ATP. You finally use it. You slice off that one phosphate group. What are you going to do with ADP? I mean, are you just going to throw it out? Are you going to excrete it? What are you going to do? What this does is it uses mechanical energy to take a phosphate group and the enzymes down there that's spinning at the bottom, they are designed, the protein structure grabs ADP, not ATP or anything else. It grabs ADP and uses mechanical energy. The non-spinning part right next to it grabs phosphate groups and uses the mechanical energy to reattach it to ADP to reproduce ATP. So you literally have these little spinning mechanisms in every cell of your body that is able to reattach a phosphate using ion concentration differences, so you have more ATP and can function. So you're not just always having to produce ATP and then have to reproduce it over and over and over and over again. You can reuse the ADP, reconvert it back to ATP, and use it again. Every one of you, this is happening. It's not happening as much now as it will after lunch. Okay? But it's happening right now. You look at that. We cannot create anything like this yet. And if we ever, it's too small. It's microscopic. But it's a mechanical device. And it uses the shape of the proteins, only grabs a certain kind of molecule, ADP, and another kind of molecule, phosphate, and in that one little spot down there at the bottom, attaches them together using, how in the world did anyone know about the pressure gradient produced by having more ions up here than down here? And if the cell becomes imbalanced, it can actually reverse itself to get the cell back into balance by kicking stuff back out of the mitochondria. And it's on a scale we can't even get close to yet. Now, will we get there someday? Maybe. And what will that prove? It took a lot of design to get there in the first place. And so this is what I presented. Now, obviously, I didn't spend nearly as much time in the debate. I could only, let the little video run and explain. This is so obviously, plainly, and clearly designed. I am not saying now, and so I say to you, oh, morally neutral person, please look at this and realize intelligent design exists, because, intelligent design doesn't require, for example, the triune God of Scripture. All right. So I'm not saying this is the be all and end all of all things. It's just that there is so much of this that points us directly to the reality of our created nature. That was my use of the presentation. And it really is amazing. I've actually seen electron micrograph videos, and you can just sort of, what they'll do is they'll attach a molecule down here that sort of extends out, and you can just see it going around and around and around and around. And it's happening right now for all of us. If it wasn't happening for you, you would be about to die. Cyanide, for example, destroys this. That's why it kills you almost instantly. It's the eyes, everything in the cell. You got to realize Darwin did what Darwin did before we understood cellular biology. And that theory never would have gotten anywhere if there had been a knowledge of how utterly complex the cell is. We knew about cells, but we didn't have any idea of how completely designed and complex they are. And that was what I used in the presentation there. So yeah, that was what was in the thing. So I thought since I had that up, might as well throw that up there, and you can see how that worked in the debate. It is on YouTube. Okay, so there is a ton of philosophical discussion that has been had. There are in-depth books. Like I said, Bahnsen went into all this stuff, and some of you have listened to the Sproul stuff. Bahnsen and Sproul together. It does really seem to me, when you ask the question of how can Reformed folks, from my perspective, let me put it this way. From my perspective, I would suggest to you that if you read the opening chapters of The Institute of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, and realize that he lived in a sacral society, church and state were very much interconnected, inappropriately, I would say, but that's what they had inherited from the medieval period. You didn't have atheist groups and things like that. You had heretics like Michael Servetus, who denied the Trinity, but they weren't atheists. They were probably atheists around, but they kept their mouths shut because that would be the end of you. So Calvin is not dealing with the same apologetic challenges that we are facing today. But when you read his discussion of the sensus divinitatis, the knowledge of God, that is present in every single human being, that they are suppressing the knowledge of God. And if you ask the question, all right, if we transport his system out of the sacral post, second generation Reformation context into a situation where secularism, atheism has become the be all and end all of all things, how would he argue? What would be the consistent continuation of John Calvin's understanding of mankind, revelation of God? And as you know, if you've read the Institutes, and I highly would recommend them to you, especially the first book, but there's gems all through it. Book 4, not as much, but the books 1, 2, and 3 especially. What would his apologetic system be? Because there are people who argue specifically today, Stephen, what's his face, of Christian nationalism fame. I'm sorry?
Wolf?
Yeah, Stephen Wolf. He detests presuppositionalism. He's very much a Thomist, natural law, natural theology. And I gave a presentation at ReformCon in response to his position along those lines. And my argument was, you read the Institutes and make application to the situation today, and there's no question that he would have been a presuppositionalist. Now, I hate to take people from the past and shove them into categories like that, but what I'm saying is the argumentation he makes about the primacy of the knowledge of God in the creature is exactly what Van Til was talking about. And I think Van Til, Kuyper, and the others who have developed this are doing so consistently with the arc of Reformed theology, and that those who would try to bend Reformed theology toward Thomas and that perspective are really going the wrong direction in a big, big way. So that's highly important. Obviously, if this is what scratches your itch and gets you excited and everything else, this would be a direction to go in your studies. For example, I think, was it Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism that really moved forward from the Institutes at this point? That'd be something really that you might enjoy spending time on for your project, whatever else it might be. Because there is much that can be said and go into deeper with that. But we only have a certain amount of time left to talk about Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Canada Scripture, and everything else. So we've pretty much taken the time that we've got for that. But if you do want to see, like I said, if you really want to see modern application of this stuff, Jason Lyle, Eli Ayala would be a good resource, places you can go to press on with that. So before we make a transition, any questions, comments on that? Yes, sir.
Do you think the debate with Sproul would be the best one to watch to kind of get his rationale for national?
Yeah, except he really didn't get into it as much. It wasn't all that long of a conversation. But you're still left, even when you listen to the Bahnsen-Sproul exchange, you're still left wondering, but RC, why? And, I had dinner with RC a couple times after all of that took place and stuff. We didn't really get into it. We were talking more about federal vision stuff and things like that. I would like to have, in hindsight, taken that time to do a little more discussion. But R.C. Sproul, a guy named Lindsley, and another guy, wrote a book called Classical Apologetics. as a response and rebuttal to Van Til. I actually used it as a textbook in an apologetics class at one point as a comparison. And it was extremely disappointing. Bahnsen, I think, Bahnsen was aware of it and reviewed it, and it was really, he tore it apart really, really well. There was a fundamental mental block on their part in getting to really understand what Van Til was saying. And I don't think it was because of a lack of clarity on Van Til. I think it was because R.C. said the greatest Christian theologian that ever lived was Thomas Aquinas. And if you really function on that, and of course his mentor believed the exact same thing, if you really function on that level, it's hard to break out of the strictures that Thomistic apologetic thinking places you in. And, we, as most of you know, the president of the seminary here has taken a strong stance against the growth within Reformed Baptist circles of a fascination with Thomism and Thomistic categories. We've had to be dealing with things like what is a biblical doctrine of divine simplicity versus a Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity, because it has impact on a lot of things. And in some senses, we're in the minority. The Presbyterians allow both perspectives. Presbyterians have a wider expression of confessional fidelity than most of us have. And I think we're going to have to learn from them at some point or split. And Baptists are really good at splitting. I remember once a Presbyterian brother of mine was driving me out to Andersonville. Anybody know what Andersonville was in Georgia? One person, the Andersonville prison, where the South kept Northern prisoners. Bad place. And we're driving through these little towns, and you come to this little town, and you'd see the First Baptist Church. You drive a little farther, there's the Second Baptist Church. And the farther you get out of town, Third, Fourth, all the way out to the Seventh Baptist Church. And having been in Baptist churches my entire life, I know why those churches split. And it was over carpet color and all sorts of other really dumb stuff. So we are really good at splitting. And Reformed Baptists are going to do the exact same thing unless we become a little more small c Catholic, even with ourselves, and not insist upon a massively strict interpretation of the confession in it's got to be just this way. So you know what happened 15 years ago when there was a big split over impassibility amongst Reformed Baptists. And honestly, I read the positions on both sides at the time. And what I said then is what I'll say now. You couldn't have slipped a number 10 envelope between the two positions. They're that close. But Reformed Baptists thought it was important enough for 1/3 of the churches that were in fellowship with ARPA at the time to leave. And it wasn't so much those churches that wanted to leave, it was the other 2/3 that wanted them to leave. So, yeah, I honestly think we really need to adopt I really think if we would do more evangelism and cultural work with at least our Reformed brothers outside of us and get to love them and know them, we'd probably get to, the people you get the maddest about are the people that are the most like you but have one difference. Some of you may, absolutely detest Cross Politic and Doug Wilson and Chocolate Knox and all those guys up there in Moscow. But I've spoken with them up there. I've been on the program and I've debated them. In fact, you're looking at the person who has debated Doug Wilson more than anybody else on the planet. And he'll confirm that. And that's why we can get along so well. because we haven't swept the differences under the rug. But it seems like Reformed Baptists think that's what we have to do to stay in unity with one another. No, if we keep going that direction, we're doomed as a movement. We'll become irrelevant. And Apologia Church, you've got to give us credit. We stand firm on what we believe, but we'll work with all sorts of folks. And then sit down and over dinner and have a good old knockdown, drag out fight about where our differences are, but then hug and shake hands and we leave. And it just seems like a lot of Baptists, fundamentalist Baptists, I think fundamentalism still sneaks in amongst us. And that's what gets rid of any Catholicity, small c Catholicity, that Reformed Baptists should have toward one another. Sorry about that little sermon, but you've got to deal with this stuff out there in the churches. And you've got to make decisions. If the people in my town are getting together to seek to stop drag queen story hour, who am I willing to work with at that point? What are the issues where this far and no farther? Does anybody remember Operation Rescue? Operation Rescue, Randall Terry, back in the late 80s, they would close down abortuaries by chaining themselves around the front door so you couldn't get in or out. And you'd use these uncuttable locks and stuff like that. And I worked with them for a while as a sort of a media representative. So I would be on the radio programs and I'd be debating people. And if you think I'm merciless in theological debates, you ought to see when I'm dealing with a pro-abort. And yes, I was arrested once outside of Brian Finkel's abortion clinic, who only a few years later was arrested and died in prison for sexually abusing his, when it was discovered he was sexually abusing his patients. The man was demonized. That there is, if you want some of the clearest evidence of the demonization of someone, just listen to Brian Finkel speak. We've got another guy in Phoenix right now. He's pulled a gun on us. He just came out and punched somebody in the face. We're hoping he's finally going to get his license revoked. But man, these people are just vile. Anyways, long story short is I was asked to leave association with that because I wrote The Fatal Flaw in Answers to Catholic Claims at that time. And they couldn't have someone who took a firm stand on Roman Catholicism involved in leadership in that group. So where do you draw that line? It's going to be different for different people. I can do all sorts of stuff with my Presbyterian brothers as long as I can speak the truth about the New Covenant. As long as Hebrews 8 stays in the New Testament, I can't join you up on that stuff because y'all have never been able to answer my objections to that. And the debate with Jared Longshore proved that. But I can't be an elder in one of those churches. And that's one of the things the CREC. The CREC has both. The CREC says that the London Baptist Confession is an acceptable confession of faith for a cooperating church. But what do you do if you have people in your church who want to have their children baptized? I can't do it. What about if you've got people who believe in paedo communion? Because the CREC does. Well, Greg Strawbridge said they didn't, because CREC's position on paedo communion is they need to be old enough to desire the supper. So maybe 2, 3, something along those lines. A true paedo communionist will take a piece of bread, soak it in wine, and shove it down a baby's throat. That's a true paedo communionist. That's what Greg Strawbridge would do. So Strawbridge didn't think that Doug Wilson was even a paedo communionist. And some of you may not know, I debated Doug on this subject a couple of years ago up in Moscow. Like I said, we've debated all sorts of stuff. Where do you draw those lines? Those are big questions. And when it comes to apologetics, it's some of you had said, well, it seems like Frank Turek has said similar things. Yeah, they do fall into it. But then when you ask the question about the gospel and Roman Catholicism, we're on different pages. When you ask about the deadness of man in sin or predestination election, we're on different pages. And we'll answer those questions in a different fashion. So there you go. Anything else on that element of things? Okay, now, your professor has, as far as numbers of debates, the group I've done the most debates with now is Roman Catholicism. That they were the leaders for a long time. Then about 5-6 years ago, Islam became the group that I had done the most debates with. But now that I'm not traveling to South Africa or London, Roman Catholicism is back in the lead there. Yes, sir?
What is the Muslims' motivation for debating you on these topics?
Well, that's an interesting question. What is the Muslims' motivation for debating me? Did anybody happen I know you're busy right now, you may be traveling, stuff like that. Did anyone happen to look up Ahmed Deedat that I mentioned the first day? Muslims in majority Muslim nations do not believe if you want to cringe, okay, some of you are too young to understand this. If you want nails on a chalkboard, okay, now if you've never heard nails on a chalkboard, you can never understand this. There is no sound that is more grating to the human ear than nails on a chalkboard. You just go, oh, whenever you hear it. Look at this. Ahmed Deedat versus Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart.
All those Christians are just alike, so I'll just debate this guy, not realizing that that's what we think about Muslims, probably the same thing. They're all the same.
Yeah, probably, but the stupidity of Swaggart to have done this or the hubris of Swaggart, it was a absolute massacre. It was horrific. So if you want to watch something that is just, wow, yeah, that was it. But here is his...
What, like a week ago?
What? Yeah, Swaggart died just like 5 days ago. He was, 90? I think he was 90 years old. Here is Ahmed Deedat.
How do you spell it? D-A-T?
I'm sorry?
How do you spell it? D?
D-E-E-D-A-T. Deedat.
Okay, thank you.
If we react strongly, we can understand. Because his salvation depends upon his belief.
That's
him,
Deedat.
the most important thing of his religion.
And so you see him, and he would stand there. He'd have the open collar, the suit, the Muslim hat, microphone. Like I said, if I brought up my debates, what was that guy's name? What was his name? Hold on a second. Ayub Karim. Ayub Karim. Let me see if that pulls it up. Yep, there it is. So here, did Jesus preach Islam or Christianity? Is Jesus God? We did crucifixion or crucifixion as well. That's Shabir Ali, by the way. But yeah, this is in South Africa, down in Durban. These are words that were spoken in history at a particular point in time. We can still locate where they happened. Nothing that Jesus says in the Quran takes place at a point in history. Nothing. There is only one time when Jesus speaks in the Quran that
you'll find that contradictions will arise in the Bible, but it is not for me to sort out those contradictions within the covers of the Bible.
His whole thing.
That is something that Dr.
Dress like him,
has to deal with.
Speak like him.
But the contradictions...
He's trying to be Ahmed Deedat.
So let me begin.
So you can...
What did Jesus Christ preach?
I wish I could have debated D-Dot, but like I said, he died in 05 and I started studying Islam in 06. But if you want to hear what it would have looked like, you can listen to Ayub Karim and me do this. But here he is. And so in answer to your question, the Muslims who hear D-Dot speak, and again, he's been dead for 20 years. He is still the most listened to Muslim in the world. No question about it. Other than the debate he did with Josh McDowell, where Josh McDowell spanked him, he spanked everybody else he debated.
Is that one online too?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's what they see. In Muslim countries, they don't see Christians able to respond to their objections. And so I come along and they don't know what to do with me because I will accurately represent them. I'm not going to use bad argumentation, but I'm not going to back down. And I also show them respect, and I clearly care about them as individuals, call them to faith in Jesus Christ. And that's, after a while in South Africa, I could tell some of the Muslims were like, maybe this isn't the best idea we've ever had. But it took a while. It took a while because a lot of the people in the audience, they're not hearing what I'm saying initially. And some of them may never hear what I'm saying. That's part of the reality of doing debates. When I go into debate, I know my audience is a sliver about this big. If the whole audience is a semicircle, there is this perspective of people on their side, they're not going to hear a word I say. They're not listening to what I say. And there's the same thing on my side. They're not going to hear a word the other guy has to say. It's this center section is what I'm concerned about. The people on my side who maybe are thinking about this other perspective, whether it's Roman Catholicism, Islam, Unitarianism, whatever, I want to rescue them. I want to strengthen them in their faith. Then there's going to be a part of that sliver that are people who just want to learn how to reach the other side. So those are the people on my side I'm trying to minister to. Then over on this side, there are those people who are going to listen to what I have to say. And so I have to do it in such a way that they're going to be able to understand my speech. And I'm not talking about my accent. I am going to use their language. I am going to speak in a way that they will be able to understand. And when it comes to Islam, most people don't know how to do that because they don't understand Islam enough. That's why most Christians are afraid to talk to Muslims because they're afraid they're going to offend them because they don't know what would be offensive in the first place. And so they skip the opportunities to be able to talk to them. It happens. It really does. But this guy started Islamic dawah. Dawah is, in Islam, dawah is calling to Islam. So it's both evangelism and apologetics are all one thing in Islam. It's called dawah. So a person who does dawah is a da'i. And so he was a da'i. And if you listen to his own story about how he started, he was seeing Christian missionaries converting Muslims, and he found a book that was written in 1864 by an Indian Muslim scholar called The Vindication of Truth. And what that Indian scholar did was he took all the German liberalism of his day in Christian circles and translated it into an Islamic understanding, an attack on the Bible. And the book itself didn't have a huge audience until D-Dot found it many, many years later. And now it's been read by all of them. And they all follow his, in Muslim countries, they follow his example. Once they get into the West, sometimes they start, Shabir Ali isn't a D-Dot clone or something like that. But you're looking at the man who, the most important person in convincing Muslims that Christianity did not have answers to their objections.
What a great name for a speech, too. Crucifixion.
Yeah, crucifixion, F-I-C-T-I-O-N. Yeah. Yeah, if you want, like I said yesterday, if you want to understand the Muslim mindset, listen to this one. Listen to his crucifixion or crucifixion lecture. That's in Cape Town. I lectured on Islam in Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg, and Erasmia, all over South Africa. It's a beautiful country, wonderful people. It's in massive turmoil now and would be an unsafe place for me to travel any longer, sadly. But there are still good, faithful Christian churches down there. Antioch Bible Church in Randburg outside of Johannesburg. Wonderful people. I miss them horribly. I really do. But, God's providence is God's providence. But I gave many lectures refuting D-Dot in South Africa, and they would come listen. They would come listen. They really would. So, what I was saying was, we're going to take a break at noon. I have not heard from one of my trucks ready yet, unfortunately. I'm going to have to give them a call. But we'll have 3 hours after lunch, and then we've got tomorrow morning. What I can do during that time period, I did talk a little bit about canon already. I could sort of sneak that into some of the other ones, but I would have enough time to do a real solid job in getting you up to a pretty decent speed on Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and maybe Rich Pierce talking from the back row, or as well as some key issues within Roman Catholicism, such as especially the Marian dogmas. It seems like the internet is making a lot of us much more aware of the depth of devotion to the Marian dogmas recently, because groups like Protestia go out and grab all these videos that we otherwise would never see, that show us just how central Marian devotion is to Roman Catholic experience. And in my opinion, the Marian dogmas are the best example of what happens when you deny sola scriptura. The early church did not believe these things, and yet now they are absolute dogmas. And in fact, you have to believe the early church believed it, even when they didn't. So we could do all of that, but if there's a particular, if you as a group have a particular concern, want more emphasis upon Islam, or because they're growing. You see what's happening in Dearborn. It's happening in other places. They're showing up in places, and the thing is, we're afraid of them, and we don't know how to evangelize. I can really help with that in about 2 hours. But the Mormons are still out there, but they're changing. The Jehovah's Witnesses are always a huge challenge. And of course, with Pope Leo, we don't know where he's going to go, but Francis shook things up enough as it is. So we've got a lot of interfaith apologetics that I'm an expert in. So we can avail ourselves of my expertise in that area. So what are your thoughts?
Sounds fantastic to me. Yeah.
Sounds fantastic to me. Yeah, but what is there an emphasis that would be most helpful for this particular group? Or is it just like, hey, cover them all?
Yeah, I like getting some of everything. Yeah.
A little bit of everything. I want lettuce and tomato, and I want my onions, and I want my hot sauce. You bet.
Personally, Jehovah's Witnesses.
You need to make sure to get the witnesses in there. My presentation is dated, I will admit. There have been some interesting developments that I'm at least marginally aware of there, but I no longer subscribe to the Watchtower, and I haven't updated in about 2 years, but it's still accurate information. What is changing is what they're emphasizing. Same thing with the Mormons. What they're emphasizing is changing. There's no two ways about it. But we can talk about that. And you've got to understand their fundamental theology. Jesus as Michael the Archangel, Who were the 144,000? Who are they now? Who's the great crowd? How do you get into the, that's all important stuff. Anybody else, if you want to make your desires known, now's the time to do it.
Catholicism.
Roman Catholics are still out there.
Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism, yes. Okay, well, I'll ask Brother Moore to come in and do some Zoroastrian stuff. Huh? What did somebody say?
I just said Egyptology is.
Egyptology. You'd be surprised at how much Egyptology I could give you. Why?
No, I would not be surprised, I promise you.
Why?
Mormonism.
Book of Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price. Yeah, you have to. I'll try to make sure. And if I go through the Mormon stuff and I don't do this, remind me, because we have one of our most famous tracts is called "Min is Not God." M-I-N, separate word. Min is not God, and that is a nuclear weapon when it comes to Mormonism, because the Book of Abraham is is a gaping wound in Joseph Smith's credibility. It is one of the clearest documentations and evidences of the falsehood of Joseph Smith as a prophet that there ever could be. It's a fascinating story. It really is. There is a book, I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, but I've seen it online, by Larson, called By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus. It is, if you're going to be dealing with Mormons, that's top level stuff. Top level stuff. Okay. All right. We'll hit it after lunch. You've got an hour and 5 minutes or so.